So Lot was occupying this territory that was a part of that war, and he became a hostage and a captive, a slave, like everyone else that was as a consequence of that war that was going on. But it's really interesting, and of course he's going to go to his Lot's rescue. And it's interesting, this is the first time that we talk that Abram, the Hebrew, the son of Shem, and this is the first time Abram is, that's ever comes out there, that this is a Hebrew, setting him apart from all the other people and other nations there. And he's living at the oak, so he has his three allies as well, Mamre, Amorite, and Eshcol. And it's interesting that him going into battle to go retrieve Lot, these three men should have gone with him because they were all in allies together, but Lot didn't ask for their help. He just had the 318 men. He was going to do it. And later on we'll see that that's what gives more of the work, the glory that God did it, because it was just Abram and his 318 men just basically destroyed ended it, and retrieved Lot and all of his possessions. And it's also interesting just how geographically the word gets redacted a little bit, because we're referring to things, because later on in history some of the names of these locations have changed. Like the Valley of Siddim is now the Salt Sea, because later on in history that sea ends up expanding and that valley no longer exists. Now it's under a part of that sea, the Salt Sea. And it's also interesting, like the Pitman pits, and because that they're being by there, they had pits of tar and salt and all those things geographically going on right there, where a lot of the men ended up falling into. But and then when he says that he went in the pursuit as far as Dan, well, Dan doesn't even exist yet, but they're telling you it's in the region where Dan was going to be in about 600 years from now. So it's just interesting how those names are all changed and re-edited as this story has been told throughout, just to make sure that they understand geographically, because the geography has changed, certainly since Dan existed. And but again, these 318 men were kinsmen or slaves, part of his household, that had been born underneath part of his household. And later on we'll learn how, without a son, these were his slaves, and this house was going to be inherited to those people that were underneath him. He had no blood inheritance at this time. But I think it's also interesting how these 318 men didn't even ask. I mean, they just boom, ready to go in for battle and go to retrieve Lot, and they're going to do it without anybody else's help, So it tells you also what kind of men they are, or what they thought of being a part of Abram's household. And then they return. They don't even defeat. I mean, some translations are literally like there was a slaughtering. I mean, it was without a doubt a victory from Abram's side. But what's real interesting here now is we come into Melchizedek, and that's going to be a whole nother story. And this is such a brief little even moment, and we're not really told a lot about Melchizedek, and there's a lot of theories about who he is. But what I think is really interesting leading up to that, in verse 17, after he defeats, he goes out there. He had two kings come out to greet him. He had the king of Sodom comes out to meet him, and then we had the king of Melchizedek of Salem comes out to meet him. So they both have come out to meet him after this victory. And Abram has he's making a choice right here as we read it, a choice between king of Sodom and the king of Salem, Melchizedek. And Sodom, we know its reputation. This is a cruel, evil place. Sodom and Gomorrah has their reputation, so he's basically choosing between a corrupt king Sodom representing Satan and Melchizedek, the high priest, king of peace. So he's these two men represent two different ways, two different ideas. And so it's interesting that they both come out. But Melchizedek, he comes out bringing out bread and wine to feed them. And I think it's going to be interesting when we get into Matthew 22 with our New Testament reading. We're going to be talking about that wedding feast. You know what I mean? So this is kind of an image of that, or what Melchizedek is offering, bread and wine. And being the priest of the God Most High, El Elohim, right? And blessed be Abram, by God Most High, El Elohim, possessor of heaven and earth, and blessed be El Elohim, who has delivered your enemies into your hand. So again, it's obvious, all those battles going on and all those other things, and it was obvious that it was done by God, that God did this, because only his 318 men is what it was. It just gave proof that God was behind this thing. And it's interesting too that Abraham, he gives him a tenth of everything to Melchizedek. And the king of Sodom says, give me the persons, but take the goods for yourself. Because what does Satan want? Satan doesn't want wealth, he wants the people. You know? And so you're understanding, you're getting a picture of foreshadowing, not only a foreshadowing here of Messiah, also how Satan operates. And Abram says, I have lifted my hand to Yahweh El Elohim. He knows his name. He knows the name of the God the Most High. And that shows you both Melchizedek and Abram right here, what sets them apart from all these other people and all these other tribes and all these other kings is that they are a monotheistic. They believe in one God. That's what sets them apart from all those other people around them. And it's interesting too that Yahweh El Elohim, possessor of heaven and earth. And this comes back so many times that even at the beginning of creation, and there's heaven and earth, and then there's Moses and heaven and earth, and there's even the covenant with Noah, and a rainbow is placed between heaven and earth, and God is the possessor of the heaven and earth. And in Matthew 5, Jesus says that no jot or tittle or pass away, and as long as heaven and earth is here, this is our God, the God of heaven and earth, the creator of heaven and earth. And so it's interesting that Abram says that I would not take a thread or a sandal strap or anything that is yours, talking to the king of Sodom, lest you should say that I have made Abram rich. So imagine that, like selling your soul to the devil almost. You know, it's like, I don't want anything from you, because then you'll be able to say, look how great I made Abram rich. You know, so he didn't want those possessions, and also Satan offered the same thing to Christ when he tempted him, didn't he? All the wealth. You can take the wealth, all the things on the earth. And that's not what, because again, Satan wants the people. And so Abram says, I will take nothing for what the young men have eaten, his troops, what they've eaten along the way. Of course, they're bringing back all their possessions, and not just people with their flocks. So they were probably consuming some lambs along the way, so. And for the men that went, so again, he did not want to take anything from the king of Sodom, but instead from Melchizedek, he gave Melchizedek a tenth of all of that. And all he wanted and what he received was then a blessing, not the possessions of material wealth. And then it's interesting that then whatever remained, those portions, he had that also delivered to his three allies. Back in verse 13, Anir, Eshcol, and Mamre. So he took care of his people. He took care of those 318 men. He took care of his allies, because they did deserve the booty of a battle like that, because that was normal. But he himself didn't want any of it. So that's his wealth was in this blessing that he was given. But we do learn, although Melchizedek there's very little that we know about him from this portion, we do get more insight into Melchizedek later on, and specifically a couple places in Psalms, but specifically Psalm 110. So I'd like to read at least the first few verses of that. And you imagine now we're going to start seeing, as we look at these few other scriptures that refers to Melchizedek, we're going to see, have a little bit more insight to who he is. And both Jews and Christians, everyone believes that this chapter 10 here of Psalms is a prophetic chapter referring to the Messiah to come. And this would have been written about 900 years later. A Psalm of David, the Lord says to my Lord, and that should be Yahweh says to my master. There are two different words there. A Psalm of David. The Yahweh says to my master, sit at my right hand until I make your enemies your footstool. The Lord sends forth from Zion your mighty scepter. Rule in the midst of your enemies. Your people will offer themselves freely on the day of their power and in the holy garments, and from the womb of the morning, and from the dew of your mouth, and your youth will be yours. And the Lord has sworn and will not change his mind. You are a priest forever after the order of Melchizedek. And this is Yahweh speaking to David's master. So we know that this is that prophetic. So it's interesting as we read Psalms 110, it's giving us what is that order of Melchizedek. And it's a reflection of Melchizedek. It's the same. It's almost like a title. The Lord is at your right hand, and he will shatter kings on the day of his wrath. He will execute judgment among the nations, filling with them corpses. He will shatter chiefs over the whole earth. He will drink from the brook by the way, and therefore he will lift up his head. That's pretty powerful for the guy that's referred to as the King of Peace. So it's like when he comes, it doesn't sound very peaceful to a lot of people, for a lot of people, that's for sure. So that gives us a little bit more insight into this king, Melchizedek, who's both high priest and king. And what's interesting too, there's a lot of theories that this could be Shem, and then there's theories normally from the Christian church that this is Christ. This is the Messiah. But I think it's interesting that right here and in Psalms they're not, and even when we look at it in Hebrews, they have the opportunity to expand who this guy is, but they don't refer to his lineage, where he came from. And I think that's in the order of Melchizedek, even if Christ comes in the order of Melchizedek, a Messiah, and this is a reflection of that. I don't personally think, I used to, I guess, but I don't think necessarily that this is the Messiah in the flesh. I think he is a real man. I think he could possibly be Shem. But if there's a second coming of Christ, how many comings was there before we know there's going to be a second coming? So is there multiple comings, or is there a first and second? You know what I mean? It's just a conflict of ideas if we think that way. So that's, I believe it might most likely be Shem. And I know that, but it doesn't really matter. But what I think is very interesting is Abram knew who this man was. And when this man approaches him, Abram knew who he was. It wasn't even a question of who this person was and what he rightfully earned. Because for him to even give a 10%, that was a tribute that was commonly given to a king also after a battle like that you give a 10%. And I think sometimes this is a confusion passage that it's not referring to a tithe. This is a 10%, a one-time gift he gave him as something that was due to him from this battle. It wasn't like a continuous tithe that Abram would be doing to Melchizedek. This is a one-time thing. But I'd like to read a little bit in Hebrews 7. And this thing, keep in mind when we're referring, the writer of Hebrews is talking about Melchizedek again. this is like 1900 years later now, and we're going to start getting into even a deeper reflection into the character and who Melchizedek is here. So I'd like to read Hebrews 7, actually quite a bit of it actually, but for Melchizedek, king of Salem, and again the king of Salem, this is eventually they believe is to be Jerusalem, the priest of the Most High God, met Abraham returning from the slaughter of the kings, and blessed him, and to him Abraham apportioned a tenth part of everything. He is first, by translation of his name, King of Righteousness. Then he is also King of Salem, that is, King of Peace. And he is without father or mother. So he right here, he would have had the chance to tell us who is without father and mother. You know, the time when Christ comes for the first time, it's like a specific moment in time from a virgin birth. You know, he comes once at a specific moment in time, in a specific way. He is without, and this is what Melchizedek represents, that he is without father or mother or genealogy, having neither beginning of days nor the end of life, but resembling the Son of God, he continues a priest forever. So here the writer of Hebrews has the opportunity to tell us if it's actually Messiah or not, but he's saying instead that this is resembling the Son of Man. This is the Son of God. This is a foreshadowing of this role, this position. To see how great this man was, to whom Abraham the patriarch gave a tenth of spoils, and those descendants of Levi who were the priestly office have a commandment in the law to take tithes from the people. This is from their brothers, though this also are descended from Abraham. And so again, this wasn't a tithe, but he's pointing out difference how the order of Melchizedek is as a high priest is different than the Levi priest. This is 600 years before before there was Aaron and even were Levitical priests. So he's a totally different kind of priest. And I think it happened in Robert's conversation with his family that there was confusion about this being said about law being done away with. Like they'll pull out one verse in this chapter, and they're not understanding the difference. What he's trying to explain here is that there's a difference between the order of Melchizedek as high priest than the order of the Levite priests. There's a difference. This is what he's trying to point out. And I guess if you don't understand that, it can really be pretty confusing. So he's saying, and those descendants of Levi who received the priestly office have a commandment in the law to take tithes from the people, that is, from their brothers, though they're also are descendants from although they're also descendants from Abraham. But this man, who does not have his descendant from them, received tithe from Abraham and blessed him who had the promises. It is beyond dispute that the inferior is blessed by the superior. He is a far more superior priest than what the Levitical priests were doing in a temporary realm here on earth. And in one case, tithes are received by mortal men, but in the other case by one who it is testified that he lives. He might even say that Levi himself, who receives tithes, paid tithes through Abraham, for he was still in the loins of his ancestors when Melchizedek met him. That offering he was making to Melchizedek was an offering he was making for all his future generations to this high priest. So now if perfection had been attained through the Levitical priesthood, for under it the people received the law, what further need would there have been for another priest to raise after the order of Melchizedek, rather than one named after the order of Aaron? For when there's a change in the priesthood, that's what he's talking about here, that there's necessary a change for the law as well. For one of them whom these things were spoken belonged to another tribe, for which no one has ever served at the altar. For it is evident that our Lord was descended from Judah, and in common with that tribe, Moses said nothing about priests. So Christ being the high priest doesn't even come from the lineage of Levite. He comes from the lineage of Judah. And those laws that we're applying to the Levitical laws, or those laws that are applied to the temple and to the Levite priests, don't pertain to the high priest Melchizedek in the same way, because he's a higher thing. So he becomes even more evident with one another, priest arises in the likeness of Melchizedek, who has become a priest, not on the basis of a legal requirement concerning bodily descent, but by the power of the indestructible life, for it is witnessed of him, you are a priest forever, after the order of Melchizedek. The writer of Hebrew referring back again to Psalms 110. For on the one hand, the former commandment is set aside because of the weakness and uselessness for the law made nothing perfect, but on the other hand, a better hope is introduced through which we draw near to God. And Melchizedek, as high priest, represents that, the better hope. It was a one-time offering. And it was not without an oath, for those who formerly became priests were made such without an oath, but this one was made a priest with an oath by the one who said to him, the Lord has sworn and will not change his mind, you are a priest forever. Again, referring back to Psalms 110. This makes Jesus, Yeshua, the guarantor of a better covenant. That order of Melchizedek represents a higher priesthood and a better covenant than what the Levites could offer, that required continual sacrifice. The former priests were many in number because they were prevented by death from continuing in office. They weren't even, their whole lives, they died too. But he holds his priesthood permanently because he continues forever. Consequently, he is able to save to the uttermost those who draw near to God through him, since he also lives to make intercession for them. Because our high priest is still alive, because he is resurrected, he is making intercession for us. For if we indeed fitting that we should have such a high priest, and this is Messiah's foreshadowing, holy, innocent, unstained, separated from sinners, and exalted above the heavens, he has no need, like those high priests, to offer sacrifices daily for his own sins and those of the people, since he did this once and for all. He offered up himself. For the law appoints men in their weakness as high priests, but the word of the oath, which came later than the law, appoints a son who has been made perfect forever. So again, this isn't a scripture that's saying that law is done away with. This is a scripture talking about the order of Melchizedek, and that pointing out the differences between the Levitical priesthood and this Melchizedek priesthood, where those laws that pertain to them on daily sacrifices doesn't pertain to this order of priesthood of Melchizedek, who is a foreshadowing of our Messiah.
Seems like there are several other layers of foreshadowing in that story too, because it's not just that Melchizedek foreshadows the Messiah, who has this mysterious lineage and eternal aspect, but his title, King of Righteousness, and Abram. When Abram's forces defeat these 5 kings, one of whom is named King of the Nations, the King of Goyim, and he takes back all of the people of Sodom and Gomorrah and all of their possessions, and then he gives a tenth of everything to Melchizedek. Well, a tenth of everything would include those people. So he gives a tenth of the people of Sodom and Gomorrah over to the King of Righteousness, took them away from the King of the Nations, gave them to the King of Righteousness. This is like the seed of Abraham going out into the world, conquering it for the King of Righteousness and redeeming some of those people who used to belong to Sodom and Gomorrah, and handing them over. And that's the greater hope that Hebrews is talking about. This priesthood of Melchizedek foreshadows this greater hope. And whether Hebrews is written by Paul or not, I don't know. But every time Paul talks about the hope, he's almost always talking about the resurrection. And so the greater hope that comes with the new covenant is the hope of eternal resurrection, and not just a temporary redemption or atonement that can be done at the tabernacle. It's a permanent atonement that brings resurrection.
And it sets him apart from their high priests, which could only go in one time once a year. And so Melchizedek, that's not a requirement of him.
Yeah, and we only have this story. I mean, we only have an account of Abram giving a tithe to Melchizedek once. Now, maybe he did it many times, but it's only recorded once, probably or possibly to foreshadow that same concept, that there's only one redemption for all mankind. It doesn't save everybody, but it does save a remnant of the people who used to belong to the King of the nations.
And I think we'll be digging into that deeper again with Matthew 22. That's it. Anyone else has some thoughts on Melchizedek before we go on?
Well, I was just going to say, I was reading some commentary about just the idea of the foreshadowing of, the world to come. So looking at Melchizedek as this representation of the king who will rule over Jerusalem in the future. And so it's a representation of that future hope that we will have a king that will rule over this world. He will bring in about peace, and so I think it's it's more of a looking at the future of the new heavens and the new earth, where we have Yeshua ruling on this earth with,
and it'll be in Jerusalem.
Right.
And I think it's interesting too that, like, out of all these people, we're saying Abraham and Melchizedek is like set apart from all the other nations around them. They are like very unique and set apart. And
well, they also comment about the hope of the banquet, and when the basically says, so according to Jewish eschatology, when Messiah comes and ushers in the age of peace, there will be a great banquet in Jerusalem, and at the banquet, the resurrected righteous will be seated at the table with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And so it's just that future hope. And when we look at Matthew 22 and that parable that we're about to read about, where God, we're invited to this incredible banquet where we get to be seated at the table with the righteous.
And then he offers bread and wine.
Right.
The bread of life and the wine.
Always get caught up on who is this mysterious figure, and I usually dismiss the King of Sodom portion of that, just because don't dismiss it, but just overlook it. Like, oh yeah, that guy was there too. He doesn't get nothing. He sucks. but I really appreciated the way you explained that, Brad, because I hadn't really thought about it that way, but it makes perfect sense. And the contrasts between the two kings, and then watching how Abram treated them both and reacted, and the honor and that he withheld to himself, not for himself, but to make sure that he was honoring God.
Yeah.
And I think it's interesting too that, like, again, after a battle like this, all those possessions are rightfully Abraham's, and he returns it to Sodom and his other three allies, because they rightfully earn it too.
Right.
And it's interesting that he gave a tenth to Melchizedek, and the king of Sodom didn't reject to that. The king of Sodom didn't, because he was a higher king possibly than Sodom was. So it was rightfully, a tenth goes all to him, the highest king and high priest.
Right.
And Sodom, so I think it's interesting that the king of Sodom didn't even reject to that. Like, hey, wait, But like, everyone knew who this guy was, or this character was, and everyone knew what he rightfully deserved.
Yeah.
As a consequence of what happened.
Well,
and no one challenged it.
I always think too, just about like how we know that Yeshua is prophet, priest, and king, and so we're seeing sort of this starting to unveil who Messiah will be, in the sense that we've got the office of priest, we've got the office of king, and we have the office of prophet, and that's all over time going to be revealed. But we see this character who is priest and king, and then we see David that'll come along that is like all three, and so it's kind of like we're being prepared for that, the fact that Messiah is all three of those. You know, what does that look like in the narrative that we're getting with the beginnings of Abraham?
I think we're about to go in chapter 15 where God makes his covenant with Abram, but I think when we go back here to verse 13, Abram the Hebrew, I think that's probably one of the first, like, it's a qualifying mark of Abram for him to be getting this covenant here that's about to be revealed. One of the qualifying marks is that he's a Hebrew. He's the son of Shem. And then we had learned earlier, like in our earlier portions, about Lot and Ham and his nakedness, his mother, and defiled possibly his white mom, and his children, his firstborn, would then get the curse because he was where Shem, and then from Noah to Shem, and now Abraham. You can see it's being preserved because it's ultimately what we're trying to get to is the day that Messiah is born of a virgin. You know, that's what this story is all about, right? And so this is by Abraham getting this covenant, it's still part of that.
Well, I mean, we can refer back to the promise that in the garden, that the seed, you know, your seed, the promise of the seed,
that he would be greater than the stars.
You know, so it's like continuing that theme of the seed that would provide salvation and it would fix the sin problem.
Right. So, and then the possessor of heaven and earth. So you think that man is made from dust, and he's promising, though, he promised it to even Adam, that they would be more numerous than the stars in heaven. You know. So it always goes back to that. God is the possessor of heaven and earth, and it's being revealed, and none of it will be done as long as heaven and earth remains as a testimony to this. All right, chapter 15. Go on. So after these things, the word of Yahweh came to Abram in a vision. Fear not, Abram. I am your shield. Your reward shall be very great. And again, back to that promise with Melchizedek, he who delivered your enemies into your hand. O Lord God, Yahweh El Elohim, what will you give me? For I continue childless, and the heir of my house is Eliezer of Damascus. And Abram said, Behold, you have given me no offspring, and a member of my household will be my heir. And behold, the word of the Lord came to him, This man shall not be your heir, your very own son shall be your heir. And he brought him outside and said, Look towards heaven and number the stars, if you are able to number them. Then he said to him, So shall your offspring be. And he believed the Lord, and he counted it to him as righteousness. Again, Abraham had the faith. And I thought it was interesting too, don't normally get into that number thing, but Eliezer equals 318. His name itself could mean that, you know. But basically his inheritance was his men were going to inherit his, and how he cherished them, and I think he treated them as family because he didn't have a child, and he treated his men and his tribes as his own. And that's what made Abraham different than these other men. They might have been slaves, but not in the way that we imagine slaves, you know, but that he treated them as his own because they were the ones that were going to be inheriting what he had to offer. And he said to him, I am Yahweh, who brought you out from Ur of the Chaldeans to give you this land to possess. But he said, O Lord God, how am I to know that I shall possess it? And he said to him, Bring me a heifer 3 years old, a female goat 3 years old, a ram 3 years old, a turtle dove, and a young pigeon. And he brought him these, he cut them in half, and laid them each half over against the other, but he did not cut the birds in half. So a little about that. This isn't Abraham didn't build an altar here, and these weren't sacrifices put on an altar. This was a contract, and the sign of that contract was the dividing the animals in half. It's the sign of a contract, and this was very common in his time, and it's as common as like today we write a contract in writing. That's what, and it's like, I'm going to make an agreement with you, but I don't necessarily know if you're really going to agree to these terms unless we have a legal contract. And that's actually what he's asking God right here. How do I know that I shall possess it? He's asking, well, I'm going to make a contract with you. That's what's happening here. And when the birds of prey came down on the carcasses, Abram drove them away. Traditionally, the sages contribute this again to spirits set out by Satan tormenting him.
Keep him from making
And he's still working at it.
Contract, yeah.
Right? They're just eating at it away. And he has to work at keeping them back.
Yeah.
Right?
And then the two doves
Mhm.
represent peace.
Right.
And that's why it was like, get away from me. And then they soup up the peas before they're trying to make a...
Until the covenant is final.
This is very
And that's what
interesting.
Satan's trying to do, is not let this covenant happen,
No, it ain't
because
gonna
this
happen.
whole story
Yeah.
is about the seed of Abraham.
Yep.
Okay.
They did not, because he knew exactly the descendant's going to be the, like, look up the star. This is going to be your descendant. And here comes the devil disrupting the peace. Like, nope, it ain't going to happen. But it did happen.
Mm-hmm. And what did King Sodom want? King Sodom wanted the people.
Yeah, same thing.
And here's the Satan sending his
Yep.
tormenting birds of prey.
Mm-hmm.
And the sun was going down, and a deep sleep fell on Abraham, and behold, dreadful and great darkness fell upon him. So this dread is hashakah, right? And it actually can mean like dread, evil,
Mm-hmm.
death.
Mm-hmm.
So dark it can mean blindness. And it's a spirit. It's from a spiritual source. You know, it is some dark dread over happening going over Abraham right now. You know, and then the Lord said to Abraham, "Know for certain that your offspring will be sojourners in the land that is not theirs, and will be servants there, and they will be afflicted for 400 years." So he's dreadful. I mean, you just promised my sin, and now you're telling me they're going to be in captivity for 400 years, in captivity to people that are going to be hard on them, not like my slaves that I embrace as my family. They're not going to have that kind of relationship when they're in this 400-year slavery.
Yep.
But I will bring judgment on the nation that they will serve, and afterwards they shall come out with great possessions. As for you, and we know that's all been fulfilled. 400 years of slavery in Egypt, they came out in great possessions, and this was fulfilled. And you shall go to your fathers in peace, and you shall be buried in a good old age, and they shall come back here in the fourth generation, for the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet complete. So it's not yet, there's going to be time. It's not the right time for them to inherit the land now, but it will be. And the Lord's going to be preparing them for it. Actually, 400 years of tribulation, and even though they had bad attitudes through most of the wilderness, probably prepared them for that. It's also interesting to think that Shem is still alive. Shem outlives. He's alive even during Abraham and Isaac. Shem outlives Abraham. So where do you think Abraham learned about Yahweh, the name of Yahweh, knowing that he grew up with Noah and Shem still alive, and him being a descendant of Shem? And it's all up to the fathers to teach the truth, and that's the torch they were bearing that whole way to the next generation. And where did they get that information from? Ultimately from Adam, who walked with God, right? So when the sun had gone down and it was dark, behold, a smoking fire pot, or a clay pot, with a flaming torch passed between these pieces. On that day the Lord made a covenant with Abraham, saying, "To your offspring I give this land, from the river of Egypt to the great river, the river Euphrates, the land of the Kenites, the Kenizzites, the Kadmonites, the Hittites, the Perizzites, the Rephaim, the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Girgashites, and the Jebusites." So again, it's a covenant made, and it's usually a contract with two people, but with Abraham being put in sleep in such darkness and torment because of what he's understanding, and God makes a covenant with himself. You know, this covenant is made with God himself. Abraham was asleep the whole time. You know. And this again is the beginning of everything. I mean, it's so beautiful now that 400 years would go by till they would even see the beginning of that story unfold.
Yep.
You know, and Abraham had the faith, knowing that he wouldn't even see it. He'd die of an old age. He would never even see it, and knowing that he will have an heir, and all of his descendants are going to be in captivity for 400 years. That is that dread, dark spirit eating away at him. I mean, it's he has to hold on to the hope, you know.
Someone had pointed out, I thought it was just interesting, that when he talks about the Euphrates River, doesn't it talk about that?
The what?
In verse 18,
Yeah.
the river of Egypt to the great river.
Yeah, so like we know how big Israel is today,
Mm-hmm.
but was Israel supposed to be
Way
all that land?
Mhm.
So is that what we can expect?
Yeah.
I mean, look how small Israel is
Jordan,
today, and they're
all
trying
that.
to take like that away. And
Talking
it's
about-
like, but God had promised much more land
And they will have
than
it.
what they have today. I just think it's interesting, like, and they still are like,
Eventually he will, because once Yeshua comes back, restore all nations,
Yeah.
becomes one language, and everyone who got divided, all that land will be like, hey, this is Israel.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it will be.
I just thought that was interesting to look at. Like,
And I
what
love the fact that when he was making the pact with the father Abram, here comes the birds of prey, swoop up those birds before it was cut open, swoop them up. And here comes Terah at night. And he gave him a vision that your descendant's going to be a slave for 40 years. They already given the vision.
Mm-hmm.
So the two birds, represents peace. They're not going to have peace for 40 years. They're going to be slave for 40 years.
Mm-hmm.
And then I'm saying your descendant will be Aaron and Moses, right?
Mm-hmm.
That will be part of your descendants, and then bring him with a strong hand at the end.
Mm-hmm.
But you think about that, and you're like, you have hope for your children and your grandchildren, and he's
Yeah,
like,
all your descendants are going to be there. All your seeds going to be there.
Mm-hmm.
And then once they come out, new generations are going to come out, and they're all
That's
out
the
in the
long
desert.
haul right there.
And you're not going to see the promised land, but somebody else.
Mm-hmm.
Joseph did.
That's a way generational view.
That's a long, long way to go.
Yeah, and again, this is a contract. It's different than, and I've, always like, this is English Standard Version, and they got their boxes of commentaries and time, and they give a big old section here about altars, and I'm like, where are y'all getting that from? It didn't say that Abraham built an altar here.
That was after Abraham.
Yeah.
They started building a pact in the altar to make a contract.
Mm-hmm.
But this is
This
this is the Father and Him only.
Yeah, this isn't a sacrifice,
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
because sacrifices are made for sin and redemption. This ain't
This
nothing
was a
about
covenant.
sin. This is a contract.
Uh-huh.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
And-
there was no, like you say, there was no saying this is just purity. Me and you
Mhm.
will sign a contract, but after that, it's all turmoil. You have to sacrifice, do this, do that, in order to be present before you. That is
It's exciting.
big change.
Yeah.
You want your kids back, you have to follow what I'm going to ask you to do.
Yeah.
So it's a long walk, as we are. Still, it's a long walk
Mm-hmm.
in obedience.
That's cool. This is really one of the most pivotal parts, in this whole story. Abram, the Hebrew, was the one that makes this covenant with God, this contract. And it was for those people. It is the seed to come for the Messiah. This is the story.
Yeah, and the key point too being that Abraham was put in a deep sleep, so this is something that God is going to do. Abraham is faithful, but ultimately God's going to do the work.
Mm-hmm.